Again, thank you for joining us. And you should now be seeing, let's see, there is a picture of a cellist that you should now be seeing on your screen. And it's called the Cellist of Sarajevo. And this is a story that I like to start off with to introduce this idea of what stillness is really about. The story was told to me many years ago now, and it happened in 1992. It was a true story. And on this day, this man goes into the center square of Sarajevo, and he plunks down a plastic chair and a cello case. He takes his cello out, and he starts to play. And as you can sort of see in the image, he's dressed in full concert dress, as if he's giving a formal concert. The man is Vedran Smilovic, who's the principal cellist of the Sarajevo Opera Orchestra. And as he begins to play, in the background, there are artillery shells falling on buildings, and people are running for cover because it's the start of the Bosnian Civil War. And this man doesn't just come once to play, but he comes 22 consecutive days into the center of the square and the fighting and the war to commemorate 22 men, women, and children that have died or were killed in a breadline at the start of the war. And when I heard this story, what struck me so much about it was the idea of not considering his own safety as much as he wanted to give back to the community that he saw being destroyed, to the city that he saw around him in destruction and in war. And he didn't know how to broker a ceasefire between the warring factions of his city, but he did know how to play music, and so that's what he brought. And it got me to think about what kind of deep, settled calm and stillness it would take to be able to go out into such a dangerous situation and to offer a little bit of that peace and stillness. And that's, to me, why I start with this story. Because the stillness that we're looking for is not a stillness that means we have to retreat from our daily life. It's not even a stillness that we find in deep moments of meditation or of taking ourselves away from the world or in deep contemplative prayer, although those things are all helpful tools at times to reach that place of quiet in our thinking, in our thought, that can be so vital to finding stillness in our daily lives. But what we're really looking for is a stillness that happens in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of all of the other things going on, that we can be in the middle of a difficult relationship or a difficult work situation, or maybe just one of the busiest days we've had, or maybe where there's so many things on our to-do list that we can't figure out at all how to accomplish them. And yet, just taking a moment, we can feel inside a deep settled calm that we bring to all of those things. So whatever's bombarding us on a daily basis, the question for us is, can we bring stillness to that so that we can maintain inside of ourselves that deep calm, regardless of what's going on outside of us? So the stillness is less about changing our external environment and really about finding that peace within ourselves. And it's not always easy. And sometimes it takes work to get there, to find it, and dealing with a lot of the racing thoughts that will come to us that keep us from being there. But finding that peace within ourselves is the most important work, I think, that we can do. For me, it's the most important work I think that I do, is to start with ourselves. Now, there's a quote on the, skipped it. There's a quote from a woman named Pam Brown. And it says, at the center of the most turbulent heart, there is a place of peace, a place beyond time that cannot be touched by change or loss. No tumult can disturb the quietness. No shadow can dim the light. Here in this stillness is rest and healing. Nothing we suffer, nothing that we fear can damage its perfection. Now, I hope you can hear in that passage the sense of just that this stillness that we're looking for is actually already within our hearts. It's already, every one of you has inside of your being. And it's often when we set aside the doing mind of accomplishing and planning and thinking, that we can get more in touch with that sense of being and find that stillness. An analogy that really helps me think about stillness in relationship to healing has to do with the cello. And the first thing that you do when you go to a private lesson for a string instrument is that you tune the instrument. And if you look in the bottom left corner of the instrument there's these little knobs, little black knobs on the instrument, and those are the fine tuner knobs. And the instructor, the music instructor, will turn on a pure, perfect tone, and then the student will play the instrument on the same note, and then they will turn those little fine-tuning knobs until the instrument lines up perfectly with that pure, perfect tone. And when that happens, it sounds like there's only one thing being played. There's only one sound in the room. It's that sense of complete oneness that is happening when it's perfectly in tune. And to me, that's what stillness feels like. That it feels like this sense of oneness, of coming together, sort of a completeness or a wholeness. And there's not that the conflicts within ourselves, with different parts of ourselves, sort of resolve, that we are maybe accepting parts of ourselves that we weren't before, but that we feel the sense of completeness, the sense of oneness, and that it's really about tuning ourselves into the divine. Now, when I say the sense of the divine, the sense of bigger than our human experience, and something that is of infinite presence. And when we talk about God in Christian Science, the sense of divinity or God, it's a concept of infinite power and in sort of an infinite truth, like an unending truth. That's this concept of God, and we find it within our own hearts. It's the opposite, really, or a completely different concept than the idea of a God that is either masculine or sort of separate from us, that we pray to and we hope intervenes in our lives, but we're not really sure if he or she will, or maybe if we say the right prayer or we do the right thing, then this concept that God will intervene and help us somehow, but it kind of feels miraculous or like mysterious in some way. But what Christian Science looks at is that God is actually a scientific idea, an idea we can understand scientifically, and it doesn't mean with sort of physical science experiments, but with really delving deeply into sort of a spiritual science, a science of spirituality that looks at understanding the way that God works by the evidence we see in our lives. So for example, sometimes one example for me is knowing that we can be the evidence of God to each other. So where we see God and we understand this concept of God, and not in terms of a physical image of a being that's mystical, that is far away, that we hope intervenes, but really more that we find in our own hearts, that we find within. Jesus talked about the kingdom of God within, and that's where we find God. So this tuning in is this oneness with that God idea inside of each one of us. And that when we find that, it brings this resolution to the conflict or the challenges. It helps us to feel in tune. And the founder of Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy, she was a woman who lived in America in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And she used this analogy actually in teaching her students about healing. She said that we should always keep our violin in tune. And a violinist or a cellist, when they tune their instrument, they don't just tune it and then leave it for the day and come back to it the next day. If they play their instrument the whole day, there's a constant need to retune throughout the day. And to me, that's what the practice of stillness is about. And it is for me a practice. It's not an achievement as much as it is something to practice on a daily basis to connect with that sense of stillness. And to me, that's what it is to keep our violin in tune. That the work is always really about ourselves and our relationship with God. And that's, as we tune into God, that's what brings healing. And that's what changes our lives and helps us heal from everything from physical illness to mental challenges, or feeling mentally stuck, or feeling overworked, or feeling stressed. and that we find that sense of peace within ourselves. Now, there's two keynote ideas that formulate our talk today. The first one's from Psalms, and it says, "Be still and know that I am God." And then the second one is from the book that Mary Baker Eddy wrote called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. And it just says, "Spirit or God is heard when the senses are silent." That it takes going into that mental closet, that mental sanctuary, and finding the quiet within ourselves to hear God, to hear that voice, that spiritual sense of the divine, and to tune ourselves in. And I think for me, it does take pausing and really stopping and connecting and practicing to be still. And I'll do that sort of throughout the day, especially when I can feel myself getting agitated or tense or rushed or pressured, that's the moment to just take a moment to really kind of be quiet and be still and just reconnect with that bigger sense of divine life and divine love. So there's going to be three parts today to what we're going to cover. The first one is looking at peace and stillness for ourselves. And then the second part is looking at our relationships with others. And then the third part is really looking at world events and how we can be and feel a sense of stillness in the face of whatever might be happening in world events. And before we jump in, I'll just introduce the two books of Christian Science to you all, for anyone who's listening that may not know them. The first one is the Bible, the Holy Bible, the Christian text, and we do study that on a regular basis. And it kind of provides the religious vision, I think, for Christianity. And in Christian Science, we're not literalists. Well, I'll speak for myself, I guess, in understanding how we use the Bible. And I would say that I sort of pick and choose what the ideas in the Bible that help me grow spiritually. And so rather than taking everything literally or having a literal approach to it, or even historically factual approach, it's really about using the stories and the allegories and the lessons that are learned and taking from them ideas and inspirations of living life, and especially based on the way that Jesus lived and looking at what his teachings were and working to live those in life. And then Mary Baker Eddy's book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, the textbook on Christian Science, again, was written back in 1875 by Mary Baker Eddy, but the ideas today still have great relevance and applicability to healing for all aspects of life today. And it really takes the ideas of the Bible and the way Jesus healed and sort of talks about how do we practice them, how do we live them in our lives, and gives ideas about how to do that. This is Mary Baker Eddy from, again, I told you years ago when she was writing her textbook. And I share these quotes a little bit with you just because she was somebody that really knew stillness. And she did whatever it took to really connect again with that sense of peace within herself so she could write and teach and heal and bring that to the world. And when we come from that place of stillness and peace, we just, it establishes for us an ability to not be disturbed by whatever circumstances might try to throw us off in life. And that's the goal for all of us. All right, so this is where I'm going to have you open up the chat box now. And if you can go and find your chat box, we will start by just having a little conversation. And let's see, hopefully you guys have all found your chat box. Okay, so the question that I want you to think about that we'll chat on is that we'll create together a little vision of what it looks like to really be at peace with ourselves. So I've talked a little bit about it. Again, I really think that that's key to this sense of stillness, is just having a vision of knowing where we're going and having a vision for, I guess, how to get there. And to me, that means really understanding what it looks like to be at peace with ourselves and to really know what characterizes it. So, so that's the question. So find your chat box and go ahead and type in the chat box whatever for you characterizes a sense of being at peace with yourself. How do you know when you feel really at peace with yourself? What does it look like for you? And while you're getting ready to chat, let's see, I'm just going to make sure you all have access to it. I think you should. Okay. Great. So, so while you're thinking for yourselves about, what it is that really allows you to be at peace with yourself, and just any idea that you want to chat in there would be great. I'll just share a couple of things that work for me. For me, I know that being at peace with myself looks like an ability, I guess, that we just talked about, to be kind of undisturbed. That even when somebody or something or some event in the world or in a relationship or in work kind of throws you a curveball, I guess we say that in English, but when something happens that would try to just really disrupt your sense of equilibrium, your sense of peace, that really being at peace with ourselves allows us to remain undisturbed in a way, that we don't get ruffled. And so working on being at peace with ourselves means that we have this ability to be undisturbed. Somebody mentioned gratitude to God. Yep, I think that's great. That gratitude to God is a big piece of it, that when you are really at peace with yourself, you feel grateful. And I think gratitude is a real key. And then somebody wrote, this is great, does smiling help with feeling at peace? I think it does, actually. That was John. Thanks, John, for that. To me, it's a characteristic of it. It's sort of an outcome of it, that although maybe it actually helps as well. I haven't explored that extensively, but I think that for me, when I feel at peace, I just naturally sort of overflow, and I'm smiling, I laugh more easily, and I delight in people around me when I'm walking through the city. I notice things, that I might not notice, and I just smile more readily. So I think that's a key element of it. Somebody said that feeling at peace is beginning with what you know to be true, and that's good. We're going to come back to that idea that you start with what you know is true, kind of this sense of absolute truth, or really affirming a concept or an idea of something that's true about you. Like, for example, God is love and I am beloved. So there's these affirmations that we, as a form of prayer in Christian Science, of having a standpoint of starting with what we know and working out from that. And that's really key for healing. Someone said that feeling at peace means feeling goodness, and that goodness remains supreme over whatever appears. That's great. That the goodness remains supreme, even if we're tempted to feel a great sense of loss or despair. When we really get to that place of feeling at peace, the goodness sort of takes precedence over it. Okay, good. There's a question here, which I'll get to at the end, about staying in that mode of being undisturbed. Thinking again about the vision again of what it looks like to be at peace with ourselves. Someone said, we're less critical of everything. That, I think, is really key. When we're really at peace with ourselves, we're less critical of others and also of ourselves. We don't judge ourselves or others so easily when we're really at peace. And we're not distracted so much, that when we're really at peace, we don't get pulled in multiple directions to sort of be distracted. Someone else mentioned that being really at peace is thinking about infinity, which I love that, actually. And for me, Joy, thanks for sharing that, Joy. Infinity, which is a wonderful concept. I wonder if it relates to what works for me as well, which is thinking that being at peace really centers me in the present moment. And I stop going over and over what I wish I'd done differently, or dwelling in what I want to happen in the future and what I can do about it, and just sort of focuses on really appreciating and feeling the present moment. And so I don't know if that relates to infinity, but I think of infinity as no beginning and no end. And so there wouldn't be a past or a future in infinity either. It would just be the now. And I do think that that's really important for a sense of being at peace with yourself. Okay, thank you all for that. We'll come back to the chat box shortly, so don't forget it. And I will remember that there's a question in it as well at the end, and I'll come back to the question. So this sense of being at peace with ourselves, the reason why I think it's important to sort of have that concept of what it looks like is that, as somebody mentioned, that's the starting point, is this sense of affirming what's true spiritually about ourselves, about our reality. And sometimes when we're coming from a basis of, a background in which we are, well, and the whole world, I think, reinforces this idea of physical body, and that we're driven in some way by what happens to the feelings of our physical body, the state of our physical body, and that kind of influences how we think about things and how we feel. And Christian Science kind of flips that. And it says that actually it's the state of consciousness and of mind that can influence and change our experience in our physical body and the physical world. And when we're so conditioned to look first to how the body feels or to what's going on physically in the world, and that's our starting point, it can feel like a really radical departure to have a standpoint that says, wait, I'm going to start with this kind of affirmation of the oneness of ourselves with God. Like we talked about, that sort of tuning in that there's a oneness between all of divinity and me. And what does that mean? And even contemplating that for a while can take us into a different realm of thinking about ourselves. It really takes thinking about it from a spiritual basis, a spiritual sense, as opposed to sort of a physical mind, or sort of figuring it out with our intellect. The intellect can't actually figure out healing. It gets in the way. It gets in the way of stillness, and it gets in the way of healing as well. And I guess an example for me of this was years ago when I used to have reoccurring neck and head problems and pain, and it would come up fairly frequently and wouldn't go away for a little while. And I had grown up learning to pray for healing for any situation. And so that's what I did in this situation too, but I wasn't finding really any relief. And it was the kind of condition where I would kind of just struggle through it and it would go away eventually, but then it would come back. And finally, at one point, there was an experience where it got so bad that I was in bed one day and I couldn't move, because even walking would send these shooting pains up my spine into my head. And I just had to physically not move for the day so that I could, otherwise there was just excruciating pain. And I realized as I was sitting in bed and praying about this, I needed to quiet all of the thoughts of responsibility, the thoughts of what I needed to do, how much I had to get done, all the stress and the pressure that was going on in my life. And I needed to change my relationship to myself in terms of feeling in charge all the time. And that's another characteristic of being at peace, that we're willing to let go of feeling in charge all the time, which seems very counterintuitive in a world where we're parents and we're in charge of projects and we are maybe heading up whatever, companies and whatever it might be. It can feel very counterintuitive to think, well, how am I not in charge? I'm in charge of all of these things. And that's how I felt at that time in my life. But I had so much burden on me. I couldn't, I was frustrated and stressed and worried. And I felt like I had to get back to all my work. And yet I was in pain and my body was failing me and I didn't know what to do or where to start. And as I spent the day getting quiet, the idea that came to me was this clear message that said, I am the shepherd. And it took me down this direction of thought. And often in healing, what happens in stillness for me is that in that still place, when we quiet the senses and all of the racing thoughts, it's when we open up to the divine presence, which has a voice to it. It's not an intellect voice. It's not a human processing voice. It's a voice of divine inspiration that's always speaking to us. And that's what that message was for me about I am the shepherd. And what it taught me was that I needed to reestablish my relationship to myself, my work, my projects, and to God. And I started thinking about, and okay, get your chat box ready, because I want you just to go ahead. I'm going to keep talking, but I'd love for you to chat in the answer to this question. Because what it meant for me was that if God divine presence was the shepherd, that I was a sheep. And I struggled with this because I couldn't quite grapple with what I needed to know about being a sheep. I didn't like the idea of being a sheep. So the question is, what are the good qualities of being a sheep in this metaphor of sort of God as a shepherd and us as sheep? And again, using that concept of God as the divine power that sort of empowers, gives life to each one of us, that there's a voice there, but we hear that voice in stillness. But that voice of God, as we know that that's the shepherd voice that we're meant to follow, what are the qualities of being a sheep that allow us to really follow God as the shepherd? So go ahead, and if you're back in your chat box, go ahead and chat in what you think the qualities of the sheep are. So someone said obedience and trust. Exactly. So sheep are very obedient to the shepherd, and they trust. They trust that there's complete trust, as Christine just said, that the shepherd will find them nourishment and refreshment. I learned since I've been giving this talk, actually, that sheep will only drink by still waters, and so they have to find stillness. And what I love about that is, they're trusting the shepherd will find them the water that is still, so that they can drink and be nourished and be refreshed. Someone said that there's a surrender to the shepherd, and again, it's that letting go, that the spirit of letting the shepherd lead. And I think that's part of what my struggle was that particular day, because there was a sense of Laurie ego at the center that needed to shift to the side to let that shepherd voice lead, as opposed to the voice of I need to get this done. I have all these responsibilities. I've got to do this. I've got to take care of this, which was burdening my body. So maybe we think we can dwell in that space for a long time if our lives are functioning well. We just think I have to do this. All of this is on my shoulders. I'm responsible. I'm in charge. Maybe we can go on like that for a little while, but in this case, for me, I was forced to stop and evaluate that whole mindset. And I'll just a couple other sheep qualities. Thank you for chatting them in. Sheep are loyal. They're always at peace, right? They never say, oh, can I lead today, please? Right? They just follow. They listen and follow. They watch and listen. Thanks, Penny and Margaret. Mary says, at least you're not a goat. Yeah. I don't know much about goats, I guess, but I think the sheep qualities are lovely and friendly. Anyway, I don't know if goats are less friendly, but anyway, Julie said that sheep represents inoffensiveness, like not taking offense. Oh, that's really great. So again, the metaphor of the sheep of being unoffended, unoffendable. I mean, I love that sense of like, what if we could cultivate that in ourselves, of being somebody that couldn't be offended and also not walked on. Like so spiritual maturity, I think, leads us into this place of really where we're not letting ourselves get taken advantage of, but we're just, nothing can offend us. That we give and we love without condition, without expectation, without an attachment to the outcome. And therefore, we're ultimately unoffendable. Anyway, I think that's a wonderful quality of the sheep qualities, that if we're really following God and that sense of divinity as our primary relationship in a way, that I don't know if it means we'll never be hurt again, but that there is an element of there that if we go back to that, then maybe we can't be offended. We don't have to take offense to other people's actions. We can see it as where they are, what they're doing, as opposed to something that affects us and where we are. All right, a couple more. Mary said, you're productive. Sheep represent productivity because you naturally generate wool. Great. Thanks, Mary. I love it. The sheep they are productive because they're following and they're kind of within the context of the fold. I've never thought about this before, actually, but it's the benefit of boundaries, right? That when we keep our life contained in sort of, we have certain boundaries around our life that we're, whether it's with relationships or maybe, for example, not overworking or not taking overly taking responsibility for things that aren't really our responsibility, for example, then we're more productive. So those are kind of sort of these mental boundaries that we set for ourselves, and knowing what keeps us productive, I guess, in that way. So that's a great sheep quality. And then finally, Joy said innocence, following a leader and listening. It's great. All right, thank you all for those great sheep qualities. Well, I did not think of all of those when I was struggling with this really painful, reoccurring challenge in my body. But I spent a lot of time that day, and it was many hours, probably about 6 hours, just deeply in deep contemplation of what it would mean to not take on responsibility for others' feelings, for others' thoughts about me, for not taking on the responsibility for everything having to go well, and if it doesn't, then I've failed somehow. To really be receptive, which I don't know if we mentioned that one, but to be more receptive to the impulse of God, or of the spirit within us, like that divine spirit in our own heart, letting that be the impulse for our day, as opposed to our schedule and the demands on us. And what's hard about this is it feels like we'll neglect something. It feels like if we let the stillness guide us, that somehow we might not answer our emails, or we might not take responsibility, we might forget things. But actually, what I've found is that when it's truly a place of being at peace with ourselves, and we're really willing to follow that divine guidance, what happens is things flow in a way that it takes less effort to accomplish more. And that to me is always kind of the goal. So that's what I was realizing. I was realizing that in my prayer, I was so centered on sort of my ego being at the center, that I needed to get beyond that and have a bigger sense of responding to that impulse of God, like a sheep responds to the shepherd. And as that happened, and I realized that, there was just this ability to really let go of responsibility, to feel more like life is this adventure of things unfolding, and that it's so interesting that you just want to learn everything you can from it, and you don't feel you have to control it. And I guess that's what happened to me, is I lost a bit, that I started to see the need to overcome the need to control all the time, and instead to be willing to let things unfold and see what happened. And that mental shift for me, the relationship with myself and the relationship with God, changed my body. I mean, the pain left that day, and I could feel my whole body relaxing and untensing, and I could just feel everything dissipating. And the whole problem never came back. Like, it didn't just heal that one time and then reoccur like it had been. It just left. But what stayed was that willingness to not try to constantly take control and hold on really tight to controlling things, to be really curious and to be wanting to see the adventure of life, but to not feel like you have to control what happens, and also to really try to be detached from the outcome, to just follow that divine impulse and express the love without attaching it to looking like a certain form, whether it's with work or relationships or anything. And so that experience for me, that changed my body, that when our consciousness changes, it shifts our body. And yet we talked about the starting point. The starting point in Christian Science healing like Jesus healed, in this sense of healing, is that we start with the thing that we want to see, the vision that we want to see happen. And then we reason from that standpoint. And as opposed to starting with the problem, like, here's my problem, and I'm going to look through the Bible or through other spiritual writings or look to other spiritual practices or whatever, and I'm going to try to find a solution that I apply to this problem, and hopefully it'll resolve itself. And that model, that problem-solving model, is sort of the opposite of healing in Christian Science. Because in Christian Science, what we're doing with healing is that we're tuning into a reality that already exists, so the freedom we already have. So we're starting with the vision of peace with ourselves and tuning ourselves to that vision. And then in my case, and in many cases, the healing is the result of that. It's not even a focus. It's not even an attempt to try. It's not like I'm going to tune myself into God, and then I hope I'm going to look for the change in my body, right? Because that, at least in my experience, that doesn't happen. That doesn't always happen. Because then we're still thinking, well, I really want my body to just get better. Of course we do. But what happened for me in this day was that I let go. I kind of put to the side this need for the pain to go away in light of being more curious about what I was learning spiritually and how I was growing spiritually. And that spiritual growth prompted new insights in consciousness that then resulted in a shift and a change in the way my body responded. And that's what healing is about. That as we create a vision for what we're looking to see, which is not a shift physically as much as it is a realization of a concept, like changing our relationship to fear or understanding our relationship better to God or ourselves, or in this case, understanding better what it meant to be a sheep and to have a divine shepherd. That when we get more curious about those spiritual concepts, the result of that growth is a shift in our experience and often a change in the body. And that we find a health-giving power that's there, is available to everybody, regardless of religion or age or language or culture, that there's this like health-giving power that heals ourselves, that we all have access to. But it's so hard to get to it sometimes because we have to really look beyond our intellect and our ego to find that receptivity like the sheep to the divine shepherd. So, all right, that was a big thing about healing and peace with ourselves. And I just want to go on. I'll share one quote with you just a second here. This is just a little funny cartoon that I found. Okay, you should see it now. It's just a little cartoon of a shepherd and a sheep, and it says, "You can't unfollow me. I'm your shepherd." And so I guess I love this. You can't block out the shepherd from your life, even if you try to unfollow. I guess it's referring to Facebook or something. But we never get blocked off from our relationship to God, because we find it within. It's not a separate thing. We can't, even if we turn away from it, even if we make tons of mistakes, even if we go down a path that's totally screwy or completely messed up or whatever, and we know that we're doing it, even in that context, the minute that we shift and turn back in the direction towards that sense of the shepherd, it shifts. And we realize that we're still connected, because we can't unconnect from God and from divine presence. So anyway, little quote about that. And then finally, just this idea from Mary Baker Eddy has helped me a lot. "To the burdened and weary, Jesus saith, come unto me. There remaineth a rest for the righteous, a rest in Christ, a peace in love. The thought of it stills complaint. The heaving surf of life's troubled sea foams itself away, and underneath is a deep settled calm." And it's this last piece that I just want to highlight, that the deep settled calm is already within us. The healing that we need is not something we're obtaining outside of us. It's actually already contained within us, the possibility for healing. And it's as the troubled sea of life foams away that we discover what's there. We discover the substance of calm that influences the way we experience things physically. And that if there's any hope for healing in any situation, that's where we find it, by letting the troubledness and the struggles foam away and discovering that deeper substance and connection to God underneath it. Okay, and there's a lot more in there we could talk about, like what does Christ mean and what's Jesus saying? And I'll just briefly say the sense of the Christ, a rest in Christ. Well, we're going to get there next, actually. We're going to talk about the Christ in this second section. So I just want to briefly touch on now, what does this look like in relationship to others, and how do we apply this in our relationships to others? And so this concept of the Christ is, to me, really key for this. And Paul talked a lot about the mind of Christ in us, that let the same mind it was in Jesus be in you. You have the mind of Christ, he said numerous times in his work. And so what does this mean? Now, this is another opportunity for you all to chat in if you have your chat box open. What does it mean to have the mind of Christ? So go ahead and think about that for yourself and chat in what you think it looks like, the mind of Christ. And I'll just say briefly, for those of you that are still thinking about this, that to me, and in Christian Science, what we understand about this mind of Christ idea is that the spirit that Jesus taught about, that Jesus came as a teacher and to show us the way to live. And that because he was here as a teacher and he was teaching us how we can go forward and do the same, he was tapping into this idea of the Christ that gave him this ability to be undisturbed, to keep forgiving, to not feel personally defensive about things, to not feel like he had to be in control, to really see the way that God had the control. And so this mind of Christ that he exhibited is possible for every one of us. It wasn't something that was particular to Jesus because he was uniquely special. He was maybe uniquely appointed to teach it, but the same quality is in the consciousness of every single one of us. And so he came to show us how we can do that for ourselves, basically, and we can find that same power, healing power, and equilibrium and spiritual maturity, etc., in ourselves by understanding that we have that same mind. And that actually there's sort of this one consciousness and one mind of the universe that is the only mind. And again, it's going beyond ego, rather than all these little minds in conflict with each other around the world, that we're harmonizing or tuning in to that one infinite mind that makes us feel connected to people in ways we can't explain, maybe sort of that are far away, that we don't even talk to, but we feel a connection because of this sort of oneness of mind. And it makes us sometimes, I think, know other people's feelings. It also enables us to empathize and have compassion. So to me, the mind of Christ is really about having compassion and understanding and seeing the way that God sees. So actually, you guys have chatted some things. So someone said that Julie says the mind of Christ is to be loving and forgiving, merciful and full of faith, right? And Jesus, infinitely forgiving. There wasn't anything that he seemed to not be able to forgive. A closeness to God, being so close to God that nothing can get in the way. Again, it's that oneness, that God is not a separate entity that we pray to, but we really sort of pray out from God, that we're really, we are the outcome of God. And so in that sense, there's nothing that can get in the way. There is no separation from God. And then Joy says, the mind of Christ is the consciousness that we don't do anything ourselves, that we reflect that infinite mind, which is God. And I love that sense. The reflection is actually, that's a perfect segue into a story of reflection. And I'll just pull up this image here real quick for you. It's a story that a friend of mine told a couple of years ago, and she had woken up one morning and she had a lot on her mind, and she had this rash that was sort of covering her arms and her legs and her hands, and it was really itchy, and she was really agitated, and she didn't know where it came from. And she had grown up as a Christian Scientist, and she was used to praying for healing for herself and for others. And yet in this case, she couldn't get peaceful. She couldn't get still. She was agitated. She kept wondering where it came from. Why did this happen? She is married to a man who calls himself, I think, a benevolent agnostic or something. But and he was, really having compassion for her and a lot of empathy for the struggles she was having with her body and the itchiness. And so he was making suggestions about what might have brought it on, but she wasn't looking for the cause that created it. My friend was looking for what idea she could understand in consciousness that would resolve it, that would show her the reality of that oneness with God, where in that sense, spiritually, if you think of an idea, for example, like an idea doesn't have physical substance to it. When we put it into practice, it does, right? We can take the idea that created an iPhone And in practice, it creates this cell phone that now we all have, right? This portable cell phone. So the idea has a substance to it in practice, but the idea itself doesn't have physical substance to it. And so in Christian Science, we talk about ourselves as an idea, that being the outcome of God, of the presence of God, gives us qualities, idea-like qualities, so that we are that idea of reflection. So she was trying to understand herself that way. She was feeling like this physical being with this itchy skin and this rash everywhere, and she wanted to get a different concept of herself. She wanted to be in a different mode of consciousness where she could feel like an idea. And an idea doesn't have an itchy rash, right? An idea is pure and connected to its source. And so she was trying to understand herself in that sense. But again, she wasn't getting there. She called her sister and they had a really nice talk, and her sister gave her some prayerful ideas. And then she fell asleep. She woke up a little while later, but it was even worse. She was still very agitated. The whole day went on like this, and she couldn't quite get to that place where it was going to resolve itself. And so finally, late in the evening, her husband suggested they go for a walk. And they walk into town, and they're being quiet, and they get to this bridge, and the bridge overlooks a river. And the river is just perfectly still, like glass on the surface. And there's a full moon. And the full moon is reflected on the surface of the water perfectly. And so she's pondering this concept of reflection and what it means for each of us to be the reflection of God. What does that actually mean? So there's this perfect idea, which is God, which is always whole and complete and has all the perfect qualities in it. And so, and then the reflection on the water was exactly mirroring the moon in the sky. So she was thinking about this for herself and how she could think of herself more godlike. And then a breeze came up and ruffled the surface of the water. And the moon on the surface of the water sort of shattered into a million pieces. And then as she watched and the breeze went away, the moon came back together and was whole again, the moon on the surface of the water. Now she looked up in the sky, of course, she was pondering the original moon, which didn't break in a million pieces. It was the reflection that was all scattered and messy. And as she thought about it, as the breeze went away, and then all of a sudden the reflected moon was whole and complete again, it sparked a poem that she hadn't thought about for years and years. And the poem is, it's a haiku, and it says, "Broken and broken, again on the wave, how easily mends the moon." And she was so struck by this, and she thought, that's what I just saw. And they walked back home, and she was so just enamored in a way with this idea about the reflection and how it was the breeze that made it look messy and scattered and agitated. But when that went away, whatever that outward disturbance was, it just naturally went back to reflecting the perfect image of the moon that was in the sky. And she thought about that for herself, that she was so focused on kind of looking at the breeze in her life, this itchiness, and wondering what happened to it. Why did it come? Is it going to stay? Is it some disease she has to worry about? Should she get it checked out? Is it not going to go away? Is it symptomatic of something else? All of these thoughts it was like looking at the breeze and wondering how to get that perfect view of the moon back, when in reality, she should have been looking at the perfect moon to know that it was still perfect in the sky. And then when the breeze finally, when she wasn't focused on the breeze or the distraction, then naturally the reflection would mend itself. Well, this is what she kept thinking about. And she fell asleep so conscious of the poem and these ideas, that she felt really at peace. She finally gained that stillness and wasn't worried about it. When she woke up the next morning, everything was clear. The entire rash that had covered her arms and her whole body was gone. And it didn't come back. It just never existed after that. So, whatever it was, wherever it came from, she said, what really was important to her at that moment was that concept of seeing herself not getting preoccupied with the breeze or the symptoms or the condition, because it keeps us from reflecting that sense of divine perfection. And so if you look on your screen now, this is the idea from Mary Baker Eddy that kind of characterizes what she was experiencing. And it says, absorbed in material selfhood, We discern and reflect, but faintly, the substance of life or mind. So she was so absorbed in pondering and analyzing and thinking and getting advice from her sister in a way, and advice from her husband, and trying to consider what she should do, or what should she go here. She was so absorbed in all of that all day that she was discerning and reflecting faintly that idea of divine substance, of a spiritual idea of herself. And that as she got back to the concept of herself as a reflected idea of God, then she was able to find that calm. And it also changed what she experienced in her body. So how does that relate to relationships with others? So when we're tempted to be agitated by anything outside of us, a person, a condition in our body, whatever it is that's trying to agitate us, the mind of Christ is when we pause momentarily and an inspiration comes to us that we're not consciously thinking of, like a poem that comes back that we haven't thought of for years. There's a message there. There's something significant in that we're meant to learn about. And it pushes us in a new direction, and often results in step by step, it can bring healing in our lives as well. So briefly on the mind of Christ helping us to not react to circumstance, but to get our information directly from that kind of perfect image, that divine image of God, like the perfect moon that was reflected on the water. And lastly, we'll just talk a bit about being still in the face of world events, whatever they might be, and how to sort of not get agitated in a way that starts to affect our lives. Sometimes agitation can move us to action, but we're going to talk in a minute about a different model for action. But first, I just want to share with you this story that I heard years ago. I was working as I was teaching graduate school at the time. And there was a contest for children, and the children were asked to draw what peace looked like. So all these kids drew their version of peace, and they sent it into the contest. And the winning image was something like this. The winning image was of a rushing, roaring waterfall tumbling over all these rocks this child had drawn. And it was kind of churned up at the bottom, and all this steam and turbulence. And if you've ever been near a roaring waterfall, it's a really loud place. Like you have to shout sometimes to be heard. It's not very still. It might be beautiful, but it can be loud. And right behind the waterfall on this little ledge, the child had drawn a yellow canary bird. And this little tiny yellow bird was pictured as singing. Now, I'm not going to take the time for the chat box now because we're getting near the end, but I wanted to just say that, to ask you just think about that. What does that speak to you about? Like, why did they say this is what peace looked like? This waterfall and this canary, the waterfall represents the turbulence, the challenge, the struggles, all of the things in the world that would try to pull us under the water, kind of pull us down, make us feel hopeless, make us feel discouraged, maybe make us feel less compassionate, maybe make us feel I don't know, that there's a sense of urgency in a way that if something isn't done, everything's going to fall apart immensely. And it doesn't mean that we don't feel an urgency that moves us sometimes to doing something good. But when it becomes when it's based on a fear of losing something, or a fear of maybe a whole particular group of people or a whole particular region that we see as an other, and we feel that it can drown us or pull us underneath by the impact on us or on others, I think we lose our voice sometimes. And to me, what this represents is that the canary is not getting sucked under the water. And to be effective in world events, we have to maintain that sense of our voice and that sense of being able to offer a sense of truth in a way that helps move thought forward. And I'm just going to skip ahead here, I think. Let's see if we can. The Christian Science Monitor is a news source that really helps to do that, tries to bring a balanced perspective to the news, and the goal of it is to injure no one, but to bless all of humanity. And it was started by the founder of Christian Science because there was so much fake news going on in the early 1900s that she wanted a news source that was really focused on searching for truth And that's the goal, actually, of every article, to try to find truth and to try to share it in a way that doesn't injure anybody, but moves thought forward in a progressive way. And I'll just share this last quote, and then in the meantime, while I'm doing this, if you find your question in the answer box, you can go ahead and put your questions in there, and I would love to answer them. I'll answer whatever you type in now. I can answer aloud, or even if you just have comments that you want to make that you didn't get to put in, go ahead and you can type them in the question and answer box now, and just type your comments or your questions, and I'll share them with everybody in the last like 2 minutes or so before we end. But I just want to share this idea that the best spiritual type of Christly method for uplifting human thought and imparting divine truth is stationary power, stillness, and strength. And when this spiritual ideal is made our own, it becomes the model for human action. So there's a bunch of pieces in here I just want to quickly unpack, and that action starts from stationary power, from stillness. That's actually so much what Jesus taught in so many ways, that when he acted, he often was still first. He stood still, or he stayed where he was, and then he acted. He didn't sort of react and jump in quickly. So it came from that stillness. And that when we let our actions come from stillness, they may still be strong or emphatic. They may have a perspective that needs to be heard, that maybe isn't being talked about. Maybe it's an alternative idea for the world. Maybe it's a new perspective that people don't want to hear, but they need to hear it. So it doesn't mean that we stay quiet, but I think when it comes from stillness, it influences and it changes things, and it actually brings along the thought. It changes the consciousness that needs to change and needs to shift in order for the world and the events in the world to change. And every single event in the world that changes for the better, like the Berlin Wall coming down, it started with a change in consciousness. And that's where we start, that there's a revolution in thought that happens before we see the outcome happen in the world. And that revolution in thought doesn't necessarily come from being loud all the time. Maybe it is, but it comes from that, I think, that place of stillness, that's a strength that is often underestimated, and that actually can give us the clarity and the ideas that are most needed, I think, to shift consciousness, which ultimately changes the results out in the world. So we kind of covered a couple of different things. Again, go ahead and type in your questions if you'd like to, and we'll just I'll just kind of close here briefly. And thank you all for joining us. We've had an hour together. I will answer this one question that was posted earlier. Let me just see if I can answer this one. And then if you have other ones you want me to answer individually, I'll do that afterwards. So thanks again for joining us. The question I'll answer before we go here is, how does one get into a state of undisturbance when there's so many distractions that are trying to pull us in so many different directions? You know, I think that there's many strategies for this. And I know sometimes people try to sort of be rule-based, like I'm gonna, have rules for myself about like whatever it is, not using my phone this much, or I'm gonna try to not be distracted by creating rules. And that may work for some people. I guess for me, what works to remain undisturbed when there's so much trying to pull me in different directions is ultimately remembering to be still. So I find that the times I need to practice stillness, it's not just sort of meditation or prayer before bed, which can really calm you before you go to sleep, but for me, it's kind of a moment by moment meditation. So anytime I feel myself like getting pulled in and kind of drawn into something that is making me feel kind of agitated, that's the moment to try to practice being still. And I don't always remember, but I'm working on it. And I think that it's just remembering it sometimes that helps us to remain undisturbed. If that makes any sense. That sometimes we get ourselves pulled in and we don't remember until the whole experience is over, and we think, oh gosh, I did it again. I got drawn in and I reacted, and I took it personally or whatever it was, which is fine. So we remember after. It's not a time to beat ourselves up. It's not a time to feel guilty. It's not a time to think about how we just didn't follow the rules we set for ourselves or the guidelines or whatever. To me, it's just to notice. And then, to really next time, just ask ourselves, like, what does it look like for me to make this decision from a basis of being still, or for me to respond to this person from being still? There was a time, I'm an avid runner, and it's winter where I live right now, so I haven't been running as much, but generally I run every day. And one day before I was giving a talk, I went for a really long run, and the thought occurred to me as I was heading out, what would it look like to run with stillness? And it's funny because you're moving, right? So stillness is not about necessarily standing still. In fact, it can be, but it's more of a state of mind. And so it really was such an interesting question that posed itself to me. And I spent the whole run thinking about what did it look like to run with stillness, and how could I do that? And what happened was it just preoccupied my thoughts in a way that I felt calmer, and I had all these inspirations come to me that I wasn't thinking about. And I felt myself, it felt more effortless, the whole run. And I think that's what happens in our lives, that rather than feeling like we're running ourselves ragged to get stuff accomplished, that stillness enables us to feel more focused, and to feel the flow of things, that we respond to that flow, as opposed to feeling like we're in charge of it all, and that we're just running ourselves, into the ground as a result, and overworking. To me, stillness helps us not overwork. It keeps things in context and helps us to not get pulled in or drawn in even by a sense of overworking. So lots of ways. I think one way, though, for that state of being undisturbed is just sometimes remembering to be still when we notice ourselves getting agitated. That for me, sometimes it's just remembering it and then practicing it and noticing it, and even noticing it afterwards, and then working on doing it next time without the judgment, the self-judgment or the self-condemnation for how we failed and now we need to get better, but just to notice it and to kind of keep working every day, that it's just an adventure. The whole life, all of life is that adventure. Okay, that was one question. I have a couple more questions. We need to focus on immortality and incorporeality. This person writes, how can we improve our ability to do this? Okay, Julie wrote that. Thank you, Julie. Those are some big concepts. That would take that's like a day-long seminar. So I will touch on it for briefly, but there are day-long seminars in Christian Science that do cover this. So, but I will say that immortality, so being immortal, and incorporeal. So corporeal simply means having a corpse, right? So that we have a body, like just living in a corpse, essentially. And mortal is sort of anything that draws us to mortality, to the sense that we're going from life to death, and that we're living this finite path. And so this concept of overcoming or improving our ability to see beyond mortality and corporeality, I think, is a practice. And I think what stillness does is that it helps me to feel the infinite possibilities that life offers. That whenever you come up against a limit or an obstruction or something that's trying to keep us from experiencing infinite possibilities for our lives, for healing, for the future, for hope, we may think we've been through an experience and we have to be, psychology kind of says that we are the product of where we've been before. And unless we work really, 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 really hard, we're not going to escape it. And while that helps a lot of people to work on that, I think that there's another step, which is to really say that, as we become aware of those things, we're not bound by them. And that we can envision, one of my friends talks about a hero's journey in a way, but we can envision a journey that really works out of those limitations. And I think that so where am I going with immortality and corporeality? I think that stillness brings us into the present, into this moment, and that it brings us to a place and a state of mind that is beyond a body and mortality. And it connects us, it's that tuning in that we talked about tuning in to what's going on divinely, and seeing ourselves as the outcome of the divine, essentially, and seeing the divine qualities in ourselves, seeing the God idea in ourselves in a way that we can't forget it. And it helps us to move beyond the limitations that that mortality and corporeality would impose on us always. So that's a little tiny answer, but there's so much more to say, but I'll just leave it at that. There's one other question and then we'll close, and I'll thank you all. The last question was, someone says they enjoyed volunteering at a community kitchen last week. Does that count as being still and at peace? Of course, that's wonderful. That's great that you were volunteering. I think, thanks for sharing that. And I would love to make more time for that in my life. I think that being still and at peace is when we give without thought of receiving. And I think sometimes we give to feel good about ourselves. I'm not saying that at all that that's what you were doing, but I think we can get, I know I can get in that trap to think, well, you know, I'll give and then I kind of check off that I've given. Now I kind of feel good about myself. And I think that's an expectation of receiving. That true giving is when we don't expect anything for ourselves, that we're just giving because we're so motivated to give. We're so, we feel so much love and joy that we can't help it. Like we can't help just expressing it. And to me, that's a state of peace. That when, that, you know, it's different than, well, should I do this? Should I give to this person? Are they going to give, are they going to recognize it? You know, is he going to notice it, or is she going to be grateful for it? All of those kinds of things like get us trapped in this miasma of outcomes and expecting things. And, you know, and I don't think that's being at peace. So being truly still and at peace is giving and loving without, I think, expectation of what we get back. And I do think that that is an expression of stillness and being at peace. So thank you for that question, and thank you for serving in that way. It's a wonderful sense of contributing. Okay, thank you all for joining the Healing Power of Stillness today. Again, my name is Laurie Snorik, and I was grateful to spend this hour with you. And if you have further questions, go ahead and chat them into the Q&A. I'm going to sign off, and I will just be glad to take your questions individually. Thanks for coming. Bye.